What if the shortest path to sainthood isn't prayer, but a scream? We're taught to find comfort in icons and frescoes, serene faces, frozen in eternal peace. But what if you look closer? What if you see not what you're meant to see, but what's been hidden behind the guilt and glory? What if, behind every gesture frozen in marble, there's a story of a cruelty the mind refuses to accept? These aren't just tales of martyrs. This is the anatomical theater of faith, an exploration of the limits of the human body and spirit, where skin becomes a cloak, a breaking wheel a symbol of being unbreakable, and gouged-out eyes a promise of true sight. And to understand this strange, terrifying language, we must learn not to look away. We'll start in a quiet hall in Milan, where a statue stands, and ask just one question: what is this saint's robe made of? In Christianity, saints are revered as some of the most righteous people to have ever walked the earth. They feature prominently in Christian art, though many of these depictions are, to put it mildly, disturbing. These images offer us a chilling glimpse into the lives of Christian saints and the many legends that surround them. So who are these saints? What trials did they face? And what secrets do these works of art hold? Welcome to Weird Christian Art. In this episode, the saints. Throughout Christian history, the acts of the saints have often been seen as the gold standard for a Christian life. In many traditions, believers ask saints for their intercession, to pray to God on their behalf. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of recognized saints, many of whom lived during the time of the very first Christian communities. Among the host of revered Christian saints are many who gave their lives for their faith. This sacrifice is known as martyrdom, and it brings us to our first saint, the apostle who was flayed alive. In the Milan Cathedral stands a statue of Saint Bartholomew. The saint is draped in a long mantle that cloaks his muscular body. But there's a catch. This robe isn't made of cloth. Look closer, and you'll see the mantle is made of the saint's own skin, his muscles laid bare beneath. This statue commemorates one of the most gruesome martyrdoms in Christian history. According to tradition, Bartholomew was flayed alive. Saint Bartholomew was one of the 12 original disciples of Christ. He's mentioned several times in the New Testament as a faithful follower of Jesus preaching the gospel. In his later years, Bartholomew became one of the first Christian apostles and traveled widely, spreading the teachings of Christianity. His travels eventually led him to ancient Armenia, where he converted some of the local population. However, he was seized by the local king, who, fearing the spread of Christianity, ordered him to be flayed. Centuries later, the story of Saint Bartholomew is immortalized in statues like this one. And while it's not a sight for the faint of heart, it is undeniably a masterpiece. Created in 1562, the sculpture displays intricate anatomical detail, with muscles painstakingly chiseled from the marble. In fact, artworks like this reflect a growing interest in the science of the human body. Depictions of Saint Bartholomew's martyrdom would go on to influence early anatomical illustrations. The martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew is a common sight in Christian art, where he's usually depicted wearing his own skin as a cloak. Another famous depiction can be found on the painted walls of the Sistine Chapel. Among the saints stands Bartholomew, holding his flayed skin. And yet, he himself also seems to have a perfectly intact layer of skin. How can this be? Saint Bartholomew is the patron saint of everything from Armenia to tanners. One of his lesser-known titles is the patron saint of bookbinders, a nod to the medieval practice of using animal hides as a writing material. And though his fate was horrific, Saint Bartholomew continues to be celebrated in Christian art. All these centuries later, his statue still stands defiant in the grand halls of the Milan Cathedral. But the remains of our next saint go more than just skin deep. In a church in Switzerland stands a skeleton, dressed in the finest armor. Behind this angelic warrior is a spiky golden halo. These bones are believed to be the remains of Saint Pancras. The fact that the saint is dressed as a knight is no accident. This was a response to the Protestant Reformation, which led to the mass destruction of holy relics. As part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, churches sought to replace their lost relics, and to do so, ancient remains were carefully exhumed from the Roman catacombs. And so, the bones of Saint Pancras were brought to Switzerland, presenting to the world a warrior for a resurgent Catholic Church. The relocation of Christian remains was a widespread practice. Perhaps the most famous example is the Sedlec ossuary in the Czech city of Kutná Hora, a chapel decorated with the remains of 40,000 people. In centuries past, waves of plague and famine had caused the local cemetery to overflow. To deal with the problem, the remains were moved inside and used to adorn the church, from this skeletal chandelier to a coat of arms made entirely of bone. Even the artist's signature is rendered in human remains. The Sedlec ossuary is now a holy site, drawing pilgrims and tourists from all over the world. It's a stark example of a memento mori, a reminder that everyone, rich or poor, will ultimately meet the same fate. This was a popular Christian motif, often seen in medieval art. Another example is the statue of Saint Innocent, which once presided over a cemetery in Paris. While statues like this are certainly unsettling, there's a poignant beauty to them, and though we may not know their true names, each skeleton reminds us of the countless nameless followers, now lost to history. For many Christians, following the righteous path means being willing to put it all on the line. The following saints did just that, and are forever immortalized in the symbols of their martyrdom. In many artworks depicting St. Lawrence, you'll notice he's holding a gridiron, a metal rack used for cooking meat. But in this story, St. Lawrence himself was on the menu. As punishment for his Christian faith, he was sentenced to be burned over an open fire. Despite the excruciating pain, he managed to utter some of the greatest last words in history. "Turn me over. I'm done on this side." Today, he is the patron saint of cooks and comedians. A similar story surrounds Saint Catherine, who is often depicted with a terrifying spiked wheel. For refusing to renounce her faith, she was sentenced to be broken on the wheel, considered one of the most brutal forms of execution. It was designed to break a person's spirit by, well, breaking them. But in St. Catherine's story, as she approached the instrument of torture, it miraculously shattered into pieces. Ever since, St. Catherine has been depicted with the very wheel that failed to break her. This method of execution was used widely during the Inquisitions, especially the one nobody expects. It was commonly known as the Catherine wheel, a reference to the Christian saint, though this arguably misses the point of the original story. Our final symbol is perhaps the strangest of all. In many artworks depicting St. Lucy, she's holding a pair of her own eyes, sometimes on a platter, sometimes on stems like a bizarre flower. By now, you can probably guess what happened to her. After her eyes were gouged out, they miraculously grew back in place. Unsurprisingly, St. Lucy is the patron saint of the blind. She is especially popular in Sweden, where on the darkest night of the year, a young girl wears a wreath of candles on her head, a symbol of light returning to the world. So far, we've looked at a whole host of Christian saints and their rather grisly backstories, from being flayed alive to inventive methods of execution. But why do these stories have to be so, well, gruesome? Throughout Christian history, martyrdom was a sad reality. This was true even for the very first followers of Jesus, like St. Peter. According to one popular Christian tradition, he was crucified upside down. These stories, depicting heroic deeds, flourished in the Middle Ages and were often recorded in the lives of the saints, known as hagiographies. Collections like The Golden Legend became some of the most widely read pieces of medieval literature and inspired countless works of Christian art. And while these stories are a bit grim, they were never meant to inspire fear. In fact, quite the opposite. The trials endured by the saints were often seen as a source of hope, a reminder of the glory awaiting followers in heaven. Of course, others had to face trials of a more paranormal nature, which brings us to our next saint. Not to be confused with Saint Anthony of Padua, whose horrifying relic we explored in a previous video. Saint Anthony the Great was a 4th century monk who chose to renounce civilization in search of a contemplative life. During his travels in the desert, the saint was attacked by a gang of demons. However, through his holy power, he began to miraculously levitate, taking the ferocious demons with him. So iconic and bizarre is the scene that even Michelangelo chose to replicate it. Over time, artistic depictions of the demonic assault grew increasingly surreal. Take, for instance, this nightmarish scene inspired by Hieronymus Bosch. Front and center, you've got a giant, screaming head with an entire army of demons spewing from its mouth, including this sweet little pair of ducks holding hands. Meanwhile, St. Anthony pops up on the right, looking like he's trying to figure out what the hell is going on. We've all heard the phrase, fighting your demons, but these paintings take that to a whole new level. Judging by the artwork, it seems like wherever St. Anthony went, the poor guy just couldn't catch a break. Of all the Christian saints, few have a backstory as brutal as St. Sebastian's. Originally a soldier in the Roman army, Sebastian kept his Christian faith under wraps. But eventually, his cover was blown, and he was dragged before Emperor Diocletian, one of the most notorious persecutors of the early Christians. Sebastian was sentenced to be tied to a post, while Roman archers unleashed a hail of arrows upon him. So many, in fact, that he was left looking more like a human pincushion than a man. But in a shocking twist, despite this brutal ordeal, Sebastian was later found, miraculously, alive. And what did he do? Instead of laying low and saving his own skin, he decided to march right back to the emperor and call him out to his face. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go over well. The emperor ordered him to be clubbed to death, and this time, it stuck. Saint Sebastian's double martyrdom has become one of the most iconic and enduring tales in Christian culture. Down through the centuries, countless artists have immortalized this dramatic scene. And thanks to that miraculous first recovery, Saint Sebastian became the go-to patron saint against the plague. That's why you'll often spot him in paintings about epidemics, pleading directly with God on behalf of the suffering masses below. So we've seen saints who met some pretty grisly ends, but one guy didn't let a little thing like death stop him. Enter Saint Denis of Paris, who was beheaded back in the 3rd century for preaching his faith. Now, for most people, getting your head chopped off would be a pretty definitive career ender. But not for Saint Denis. Legend has it, he simply picked up his own severed head and delivered a sermon on the importance of forgiveness. He then proceeded to walk for several miles through the streets of Paris, preaching the entire way before he finally collapsed. Fittingly, Saint Denis is now the patron saint of headaches, and you can spot a statue of him, head in hand, on the ornate facade of Notre Dame Cathedral. In fact, Christian art is surprisingly full of these headless saints, so many that the Church actually has a special name for them: cephalophores, literally meaning head carriers. Throughout this episode, we've explored some of Christianity's most hardcore saints, holy figures who earned their reputations the hard way. What we're left with is a legacy of stunning artwork created in their honor. Taken as a whole, it's a collection that can definitely feel pretty grim. It's clear that people in past generations lived much closer to the reality of death in their daily lives, and the Christian art of the time absolutely reflects that. Through all the persecution, these saints held fast to their beliefs, allowing Christianity not just to survive, but to flourish. If you want to dive even deeper into the bizarre, check out our video on Hieronymus Bosch, a Dutch painter responsible for some of the weirdest, most nightmarish scenes in art history, from terrifying hellscapes to the freakish creatures that live in them. Click here to see more. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I had an absolute blast making this video, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw and want more, why not hit that subscribe button? Leaving a like and a comment also helps out a ton. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye for now.